right, my friends, this is Matty P, Matt Pavlichko from RT Sidebar, the host with the most respiratory years. I think I'm just old. That's what it is. Welcome to Three Ball Guys on the TV. Just kidding. This is ethics and morality. I'm super excited. Rob, Mike, thank you so much. The CSRC for having us. So, Mike, I'm going to hand it over to you to get the ball rolling, and welcome to RT Sidebar.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt. I'm actually going to hand it straight over to Rob.
Yeah, so thanks. So let's start in the very beginning. The topic of ethics is something that comes up every day in our lives as healthcare professionals, right? And through critical thinking, like Mike talked about earlier, and ethical decision making, we as respiratory therapists actually have and become the greatest advocates for our patients at the bedside. But understanding ethics and taking that giant onion and peeling it back is to understand that each of us comes at ethics with very differing points of view. So first, we really have to explore the principles of ethics so that we all understand how and why we make the decisions that we make.
And it's important to understand, we are aware that many of you probably had the Law and Professional Ethics course today. Raise your hands if you had that. Did you guys take that today? Yeah, so this is different, we promise. There are going to be some concepts that are similar that you actually discussed today in that course or in the last Law and Professional Ethics course that you discussed. However, there is going to be some stuff that you probably didn't talk about in that Law and Professional Ethics course that we need to add in, because ethical decision making is of the utmost importance in everything that we do.
Yeah, ethics guides us to tell the truth, to keep our promises, or help someone in need. There's a framework of ethics that underlies every aspect of our life every single day. And it helps us to make decisions that create positive impacts, and it steers us away from making unjust outcomes. Ethics guides us to make the world a better place through the choices that we make.
And ethics doesn't just exist in healthcare. We have to take into account ethics in our everyday lives and our personal lives, as well as what we do in the hospital.
So Mike and Rob, I've been going to ethics lectures ever since Pennsylvania told me I had to, and I hear that California needs extra ethics, as always. So I'm not just kidding. But all of these words, they all are like mumbo jumbo to me. Ethics, like, to me, is always those four pillars, because choice and integrity and value and morals, and like, it's all jumbled up. So can you guys break it down a little bit for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start with when we start with the four pillars, we have non-maleficence, beneficence, autonomy, and justice. Those are the four initial principles of ethics.
And these are the four things, the four primary things that every ethical decision, every decision you make actually, are based on. But there's a few other ethical principles that lie within these, and we'll get to those as we get going. But we have to keep that stuff in mind.
I got to be honest, it's super confusing. Like, every time I go through this, I'm just kind of wondering a little bit more. So let's break it down.
Let's bring it. So that's why we need to discuss these principles today and how they apply at the bedside. So additionally, when I think about ethics, I think I would be remiss if we kind of didn't take a little historical journey back and talk about Hippocrates, because I don't think we'd be having this ethical conversation today if it wasn't for him, right, the father of medicine. And from a historical standpoint, Hippocrates lived between approximately 460 BCE and 375 BCE. And if you do any reading on his life, it's actually very confusing. Very few people really know what he did in his life. It's difficult to separate fact from fiction. And while he is credited with the Hippocratic Oath, there are many scholars who will debate that he probably didn't even write it. But what we do know is that in his time, Hippocrates was the ideal physician, and he was revered most of all for his ethical standards in medical practice. Do you know that?
No, I learn something every time we give one of these. He comes up with something new that throws me off. But let's go ahead and get into them. So why don't you talk about do no harm? Go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, do no harm. It says it right on the screen, right? That's that non-maleficence. We have to really ensure that no harm ever befalls our patients. And to do so, we have several moral rules of societal norms that we follow, right? We do not kill, we don't cause pain or suffering to others, we don't incapacitate, we don't cause offense, and we don't deprive others of the goods in life.
And the practical application of non-maleficence is for us as healthcare providers to weigh the benefits versus the burdens or the risks of every treatment, every therapy that we give. We need to identify those that might be harmful versus those that might be truly helpful. And that actually brings into account what we call the double effect, which is part of non-maleficence. The double effect deals with treatments that we give intended to help that actually do cause some harm. A great example is ABGs. But the important part of that is to consider, is this necessary? Is it necessary with that double effect intact? Is it necessary to do this therapy and cause this harm? Is it going to be the right thing for that therapy?
Yeah, and additionally, when we think about non-maleficence, it's particularly important when we think about pertinent, difficult end-of-life decision makers, right? So whether we are withdrawing support, so as respiratory therapists, we are very much involved in compassionate extubation. But additionally, that conversation might be related to withdrawing or withholding nutrition or hydration, and in pain and other symptom control. So it's particularly important that there is an obligation and intention of healthcare providers to relieve pain and suffering, right? So we talk about refractory pain in our patient population, dyspnea. And we have to make sure that we're using appropriate drugs, and including opioids. We know opioid is a very big conversation, and it has been for a while. But the benefits of opioids, right? We can override those unforeseen or for potential consequences, as Michael talked about, the doctrine of double effect. So while we know that opioid medications relieve pain and they relieve suffering, and we know as respiratory therapists, when our patients are struggling to breathe, we ask them to give morphine or opioids. It does good, but we also have to remember that the doctrine of double effect is it could also stop breathing.
And so what that means is that non-maleficence isn't the stopping point, it's the starting point. And that leads us to beneficence.
Yeah, and beneficence, Matt, right, raises the concept of do no harm to a completely different level. Meaning that when we have those efforts to take care of our patient, every decision should be made for the benefit of the patient. And there are 5 core principles that fall within beneficence. And we have to make sure that, right, that will this option first and foremost resolve the patient's medical condition? That's important. The second question we need to ask, is it proportionate to the scale of the medical problem? The third question we ask, is this option compatible with the patient's individual circumstances? Number 4, is this option and its outcomes in line with the patient's expectations of care? And number 5, what I believe is the most important, is it what the patient actually wants?
Absolutely. And the reason I agree with that, I think the reason that is the most important is because the patient needs to have autonomy, right? So autonomy is the patient's right to direct their own care. But the patient needs to be able to make that determination of which therapy might be best, which therapy might not be as beneficial to them. And in order to do that, it requires informed consent. So informed consent is actually a piece of the requirement for autonomy. Informed consent means that the patient has been made aware of all the treatment options, not just what we want to give, but all the options available. And they've been made aware of the risks and benefits of all those treatments so that they can then decide what's best for them. Now, this obviously requires that the patient be competent to make the decision. They need to have the capacity to understand the options that are available, and they need to be able to acknowledge the pros and cons that are explained to them so that they can make that informed consent or that autonomous decision about their own care.
So again, autonomy would not be a pillar within ethics if it wasn't for the 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant. So it was Immanuel Kant's idea. Now remember, in the 18th century, right, the idea of moral autonomy or the idea that you could make your own decisions, that wasn't a really popular ideology, right? In the 18th century, everything was like, no, no, no. God directs everywhere you go, whatever deity you believe in. But Kant said the following, and I want to quote. He believed that all persons have intrinsic and unconditional worth. He says, and therefore should have the power to make rational decisions and moral choices. Kant also goes on to say that each should be allowed to exercise his or her capacity for self-determination. So Mike's talked about competence, right? We talk about competence when we think about autonomy.
Right.
We also think about someone's ability to be capable. Now, one patient's morally autonomous decision to assault another patient, that's not allowed. Does that make sense? And in order for someone to be competent, a child can't be competent. A child cannot make their own competent healthcare decision. For someone to be capable, they have to be able to interact. So for us, for example, a patient intubated, receiving mechanical ventilation who is sedated, they are not capable of making a decision in healthcare. And this is important. The other part I think that's really important about this, the entire thing about self-determination and competency, is there are times when our healthcare systems and our organizations, we don't know if our patients are competent. And we have to go out to other places to determine that for us. Mike, can you speak a little about where healthcare organizations go when we're questioning a patient's competence?
It's the courts. The court system has to get involved at some points. There's times where a patient doesn't have the competence to make the decision. The hospital can't be the surrogate decision maker, yet there's no other surrogate decision maker. And so we have to involve the courts from a legal standpoint to make sure that what we do for that patient or to that patient is going to be something that doesn't come back on us in a negative effect.
Actually if I could share an interesting story that
Sure.
speaks to that. Many years ago, I was working in a community hospital, and we had an elderly gentleman who came in who spent basically the majority of his adult life living at the state hospital. So he was incapacitated, and he ended up having a massive stroke. We intubated him, we put him on mechanical ventilation, and over a very short period of time through CAT scans and MRIs, we realized he was never going to wake up. So we trached him. He remained on mechanical ventilation. He never breathed over the set rate of the ventilator. He never interacted with us at all, and we moved him out from the intensive care unit out to kind of our vent unit. And after a couple of months, the hospital kind of proceeded forward to say, look, we want to withdraw support on this gentleman. This is kind of futile care at this point. And so the hospital approached the courts. And I would tell you that the courts, right, the lawyers all do a very good job of pulling out all the information they can. Well, interestingly enough, approximately 3 years earlier, when this person was sitting down with a provider, and the provider said, Mr. So-and-so, if you were to stop breathing and your heart stops, what do you want done? He said, I want everything done. And that was right there, the judge said, well, I understand the current situation. However, 3 years ago, a provider said that this gentleman was competent to make his own decision, and his decision was that he wanted everything done. And so we unfortunately, and it's a hard thing to have to live with, to think that we had to provide care for this gentleman until the day that he died. But that's sometimes how the system works. Go ahead, Matt.
So Rob, I struggle with this one. Okay.
Me too.
When I think of, you're thinking about extreme cases that are going to courts. All right. Everybody in the crowd right now, raise your hand if a patient ever refused therapy. Everyone's hand should be raised, right?
If you're not raising your hand, you're lying, right? Yeah.
You're lying, right? On all of those patients, did you make sure that they were competent to make sure that they could make that decision? I will be dead honest. I think I'm a decent respiratory therapist, but did I make sure that they were competent, that they knew all of their options, or was I just happy to have one less treatment? I'll admit, I was just happy to have one less treatment. Not proud to say that, but it's kind of reality.
And I find it interesting that they went back to the last competent statement he made.
Correct.
He had made no statements since then.
So this was many, many years ago.
Well,
And
think.
I worked night shift, dude. There wasn't a lot of thinking. It was just doing. That's kind of the gist of what I can remember from the case. And at the time, I think it was speaking with our pulmonary group that the decision was we wanted to withdraw support because we knew he was never going to wake up, never going to come off the ventilator. And the court, unfortunately,
That's interesting.
looked at his last, what was deemed as a competent statement, and they made a decision that, well, you considered him competent at the time to make this decision. And even though he comes in and he cannot speak to us and he cannot say what he wants, the courts sometimes are forced to go back to whatever the last competent words were of an individual and make a decision based on that.
That's
And
interesting.
I think, and then that is hard for us, right, as care providers
100%.
to say that. But that's why in these situations, we go to the courts to ask them their opinion.
And there was no surrogate decision maker
There was
for,
zero, this
there was
patient
no
had zero-
family.
Correct, he had zero family.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
I have not a similar story, but for lack of a better word, a similar story about the courts. I remember in the NICU, there was a baby that needed a transfusion. And I don't know everything about it. I just remember the doctor informing the parents that without this, the chance of survival was close to nil. Now, the parents, due to religious beliefs, refused the transfusion. And the hospital decided to go against those surrogate decision makers and take the parents to court, and were ultimately given, the hospital was ultimately given the right to override the decision maker's choice and give that transfusion to save that baby's life. It's another example of where the courts, when there is an issue like that, do intervene. And again, whether you agree with it or not, this is what happens. And we just need to be aware of it.
I think Mike, when Mike and Rob, when I think about, autonomy, I also think about what's being fair. What is fair and just? And I'm not talking about Metallica and Justice for All. I'm talking about justice. Like, what does justice mean? Did that date me a little bit? I mean, as long as everybody in
Not
the
at all. You're
crowd.
good.
So tell us about justice.
Yeah, so when we speak to justice as a pillar of ethics, so I just want to be clear, in our previous discussion, we were discussing the justice system. And here we're going to discuss justice as defined as the fair, equitable, and appropriate treatment of persons. And most important to that is distributive justice. So here's the Webster's Boring Dictionary of explanation of distributive justice. It refers to the distribution of healthcare resources determined by justified norms that structure the terms of social cooperation. All right, that was a mouthful.
I have no idea what you just said.
Yeah, I know, that was a lot. But how do we accomplish distributive justice? Well, it involves a balance. This is why, the scales of justice are on our slide. It involves a balance between increasing healthcare expenses and cost pressures that in some instances may lead to some form of rationing of delivery of health resources. So to try to keep a distributive justice concept, we think about the distribution to each person in equal share, according to need, according to effort, according to that contribution, 5, according to merits, and 6, according to the free market exchanges. Now, each of these principles is not exclusive, and many times they are combined together, okay, in application. And you can see kind of where this becomes it's difficult in choosing and balancing and refining these principles so that we really form a coherent, workable solution to distribute medical resources. And when I was working on this slide, I know Mike and I have talked about this, I hate to go back to COVID, but I know for me as a respiratory therapist of 30 years and Mike and Matt, and probably most of you sitting here, it was the first time in my career that we had conversation about we may not have enough bypass, we may not have enough ventilators, we may not have enough high flows. It was the first time in my 30-year career, and during the H1N1 pandemic as well, right? We put plenty of patients on ventilators. And I can't ever think of a time that we had a conversation about not having enough, We stood up our ethics committee at our hospital. We had critical care committee where we were sitting with our intensivists and nursing and respiratory. I was the manager at this other hospital at the time of how do we approach 2 patients and 1 ventilator? How do we say your life is worth more than your life? That's a really, to me, that's a heavy weight for us to bear. I don't care whether you're a respiratory therapist or you're a nurse or you're a doctor. It's a heavy burden for all of us to weigh. And Mike, I don't know, do you have any experiences similar speaking to COVID? What were your experiences like? Because you and I work on different sides of the country.
Right. I work on the good side.
Oh,
You work on the other
I'm not,
side.
I'm in,
Um,
I'm in somebody else's territory. I'm gonna be good.
Yeah, you might want to be. Yeah. They'll see you in the parking lot. I do. I do. Not from a ventilator rationing standpoint, but during COVID, I actually worked for CalMat in a COVID hot zone. And what I discovered and what I saw kind of blew my mind. I worked down in Imperial Valley, in Imperial County, down in Southern California, which is right on the California-Mexico border. And they had taken over Imperial Valley College, and CalMat had set up their gym as a makeshift hospital. And when I walked in, first of all, walking into that COVID hot zone takes about 20 minutes. And it changed every single day. Marianne, you know this. But walking in, what I saw home CPAPs that had been donated, concentrators, because we had no H cylinders, 2 H cylinders for the most severe patients. And then I was told, work with what you got. And we dealt with the less acute patients, but still it's almost impossible. You make do, and we did. But how do you make that choice with a ventilator? That's an impossible choice. Did any of you deal with that during COVID? I know we don't want to keep harping on COVID, but have you dealt with that?
Unfortunately, I live on the wrong side of the country with Rob, and I am about 2 hours from New York and an hour from Philly. I saw it coming. And I had a great, phenomenal infection control and emergency management person, Deb Hess. Shout out to Deb Hess. We knew it was coming. We started preparing. We saw the trucks. We saw the craziness that was going on in New York, and it helped prepare us in a way that, it was rough. I mean, I had 60 ventilators running one day and 60 high flows. 60. And I was sucking the oxygen out of the walls. Like, all of my alarms were going off. And you're saying, like, when is enough going to be enough? I do tell a story about during H1N1 where we considered taking babies off ventilators if we had to. Thank God we never had to do that. So it was tough. It's just tough. What I do like about ethics, it gives you a framework to give you some decision-making power. So you don't just feel like this is an endless debate.
That's a great point, man.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've talked about some of the stuff that you hear in the law and professional ethics course. Now we'd like to talk about some of the things you don't really hear about. We've talked about how to apply them, how the principles are set up, and gave you a minute to think about them. Now let's talk about how we apply those principles, because those principles are what we use to make decisions, but we use other things, ethical decision-making models that, whether you realize it or not, you are using every day with every decision you make, whether it's to try and make the yellow light or stop because you're not going to make it, right? Am I going to get a ticket? Is there a cop? Is somebody coming, right? Do I really need to stop at this stop sign? This is California, we roll on through, right? Unless somebody's coming, then we stop. These things are extremely important to talk about as we move forward. So, Rob.
Yeah. Formalism. There's a real long word. What does formalism mean? So I want you to think of formalism as rules that function apart from consequences of a particular act. So therefore, if an act is justifiable, only if it upholds the rules and principles that apply, and this falls in line with what we call role duty. So we're going to step in a little bit to role duty. I have a really cool scenario about this, and I'm wondering if there's anybody in the audience that would like to take the microphone and walk down this little scenario with me. Do I have any volunteers?
Oh, somebody's getting voluntold.
Yeah.
Somebody's getting voluntold over there.
Over here.
Yep.
Hi, Ivy. How are you? All right. I want you to walk a formalism path with me. So you're an RT and you're working at your cool little per diem job at a little community hospital, okay, a community-based hospital, and enroll this patient, scarring about the ER. You're at the head of the bed, and the first thing you're looking at this patient and say, this patient needs to be intubated. I need to intubate this patient. And the cool thing is that at your 400-bed hospital, 30 miles away, you intubate all the time. You've gone to anesthesia, you've gone through the competencies, right? You do your demonstrated, you do your tubes, you do your intubations. And you know that if you don't do something with this patient could perish. And the place that you're standing in right now, where your 2 feet are, says the policy at this little community hospital is that you as the RT cannot intubate a patient. So let me ask you a question. Knowing everything you know, would you intubate this patient?
Wow. She said that she would absolutely intubate that patient.
To be honest, I don't blame her. I would too.
I'm curious how many others, just by a show of hands, how many of you would intubate the patient like she would?
Wow, that's a huge number. That was like 20% of the audience.
You realize, those of you that raised your hand, that you're about to lose your license there. You're about to be fired, even if you save that patient.
And let me put a little disclaimer before we allow you to sit down. We obviously, we don't advocate going against hospital policy under any way, shape, or form, right? But this is, again, it's an ethical and moral decision. Now, if you based everything you did on the concepts of formalism, you would never go against hospital policy, no matter what it was. We all know why we have rules and policies. 1, it protects the patients. 2, it also protects the organization. Right? So those 2 things are vital and important. So if you said that you would go against hospital policy, as we've demonstrated here today, you're not alone, right, in making that decision. However, if you truly fell into the realms of formalism, you would never go against hospital policy. If you answered that you would intubate the patient, then you may rely a little more heavily on the next principle that we call consequentialism.
So consequentialism is different from formalism in that it says that an act is judged to be right or wrong based off its consequences alone. It doesn't rely on the formality of rules. It's about doing the greatest possible good. So those of you that raised your hand saying that you would intubate the patient, I made the statement that you might lose your license. And while that's true, I need you to know that I'd intubate that patient also. Because I fall more in line with consequentialism in that moment, because it is what's the most benefit to the patient. Am I going to let somebody die? Am I going to let that happen? Right? But as you've noticed here, formalism and consequentialism, they can very easily and often do conflict with one another. All right, let's talk about virtue ethics.
So virtue ethics. I'm going to give you another quick little history lesson. So interestingly enough, if you look at Greek mythology, virtuism was granted to mortals, remember we are mortals, by the Greek goddess Atea. And interesting enough, the Greek goddess Atea is always, every time you see a picture of her, she's in white. And why is she in white? Well, because she was considered to be pure. White is a pure color. And those dressed in white are considered to be pure. And she had virtue, and she granted virtue to mortals. Virtue ethics is founded not in rules, not in consequences, but in the personal attributes of character or virtues. So it allows for established practices of the profession to give guidance. And this behavior is based on what the good practitioner would do in a similar circumstance. So if this statement begins to sound familiar to you, it's because it is, right? This is where we get our definition for standards of
Yep.
care. But we always have to approach our jobs with these thoughts.
I always think about virtue ethics, about what would Jesus do, but fill Jesus in with the practitioner that you think is the awesome badass, to be honest. You know, who's the one that you want to model yourself after? That's what I think about when it comes to virtue ethics.
Oh yeah.
And we all have that
Absolutely.
person, and you might be sitting right next to that person. I hope you are. But that's what I think of. Exactly right.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt. So the last one is intuitionism. Now, intuitionism is an ethical viewpoint that says that there's certain self-evident truths that we need to deal with when treating patients. And these truths, both for the patient and for ourselves, are based on our moral maxims. It's basically a concept that says treat others fairly. But the interesting and most interesting part of all four of these is that they are always at play in every decision you make, all four of them. So you take the four pillars with informed consent, the double effect, all of that other stuff, and we apply in every decision, even if it's that yellow light or the rolling stop at the stop sign, we apply all four of these in every single one of those. Every decision that you make in your life, whether it's to go right or left, takes this process. Maybe it's not true ethics, going right or left, but it is this actual process. And all four of these, so formalism, consequentialism, virtue ethics, and intuitionism, are at play with every single decision. The difference lies in what the decision is about. With some decisions, we might rely more heavily individually on formalism. In other decisions, more heavily on consequentialism or virtue ethics. And we might be talking about a case or a patient, and Rob might rely more heavily on formalism or consequentialism, and I might rely more heavily on something else. And that creates what we view as a disagreement, although it's not. Because what are we both there for? The patient, 100%. And so we have to think about this stuff. And I don't have to stop. You don't need to stop and think when you're making a decision for a patient, well, is this formalism or is this consequential? No, we need to understand how we're coming to these decisions so that we can make the best decision for the patient. Sorry, I was a little preachy. I'll get off my soapbox now.
I will tell you guys, this is why a respiratory therapist should be on every ethics committee in every hospital, period. This is why,
Absolutely,
because
100%.
we have such a unique viewpoint, and we see all the badness. So for us to really champion, that's the way to do it, in my opinion.
No, that's great. I
Absolutely.
sit on the ethics committee of my hospital, and I know that I'm a valued member coming from where I come from with that critical care background, being a respiratory therapist. My input is very, very, very much appreciative. So that is important. So before we move on, let's do a quick recap of where we've been and kind of where we're going. So we talked about the four pillars. We talked about the principles, but we need to talk more about the moral maxim. I love that.
100%.
And how they affect our decisions. So we need to kind of jump into morality.
Let's do that.
Now, when I think of morality, I look through morality as two lenses. And that first one for me is what I call the common morality. Those are those moral norms that we conduct ourselves as humans. And those moral norms, they cross over our cultures and our religions and our regions. As humans, what do? We do not kill. We don't harm. We don't cause suffering to others. We don't steal. We don't punish the innocent. We're taught to be truthful. We're taught to obey the law. We nurture the young, independent, and we rescue those in danger.
Yeah, and he talked about two lenses. The other lens, which is different from common morality, is particular morality. Particular morality refers to norms that bind us in our from culture or religion or profession. They're basically responsibilities, ideals, professional standards, and things like that we develop over a time. A great example is the physician's responsibility or accepted role to provide competent and trustworthy service to a patient. This includes veracity, being honest, being informed. It's all of those things, but it's not just that, is it, Rob?
No, it's not just that.
What else is it?
So additionally, and another cornerstone is confidentiality. So we need to ensure that our patients feel secure sharing their most confident information with us at all times. And this principle, it's rooted in patient trust. And in order for us to deliver high quality care, our patients have to have trust in us to speak to us and to speak to us truthfully, right? And so we have to have this protected information. We have to build trust. We have to encourage open communication. And we have legal and ethical mandates such as HIPAA to go down those pathways. We have data protection. We have to make sure that we're protecting that information at all time. We also have to remember that our patients have rights. People have a right to see their healthcare information at all times. They also have a right to close down and say, I don't want someone to see. They have the right to restrict certain aspects of all of the aspects of their protected healthcare information.
Absolutely. No, I agree completely. I'm not going to.
Let me tell you a story from a professional standards. I spent, as you heard earlier, I spent 9 years on the licensing board for the state of New Hampshire, the Respiratory Care Practitioners Board. 6 of those, I was the president of the board. And I can tell you there were many occasions that therapists would say to me that I worked with, you're not doing anything for us. What are you doing for the respiratory therapy profession? And I would have to take a breath. I'd have to stand back and I'd have to say, look, our job as a licensing board isn't to elevate the profession. That's not our role. Our job, first and foremost, when I give you a license, is to protect the public. That's the job of the licensing board. It's to ensure that when I present you license 0531, you understand beneficence, you understand the patient's right to autonomy, you understand distributed justice, and you will ensure that you will not commit maleficence to any patient. The other part of licensing also is that when those bad actors percolate to the surface, which they do, the licensing board has an obligation to sit down or take action against those bad actors and prevent them from causing harm to our patients.
Yeah. And so he's a lot smarter than I am. So let me simplify just a little bit, because we do deal with this a lot. As a respiratory therapist, the organization that I can rely on to advocate for me, there are two, the CSRC and the AARC. The Respiratory Care Board does not exist to advocate for you. Their job is to advocate for the patient. Their job is to protect the patient from you. And that's an important concept to deal with.
So Mike, can I just throw this out there? We are educators.
100%.
We're not neb jockeys. We're not neb jockeys. We're not knob turners. We're educators. We're leaders. We're experts. And we need to act that way. Because we offer something that's special. And now we understand ethics. We understand ethics well, and we can make good decisions and advocate for our patients. If we're not a patient advocate, you're not a respiratory therapist. So to all of you that are in the audience, thank you for being here, first off, but also thank you for being a good respiratory therapist by advocating for your patients, because that is the most important thing that you can do. So awesome. Love this.
And Rob and I would like to thank you guys for.
Yeah, and you hung in there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. Matt, thanks. We're going to sign off.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Matt.
Hey, check out RT Sidebar. Check out this episode that will be posted soon. Enjoy. Stay tuned. Love you guys.
David Thurman does not practice medicine or provide medical services or advice. Any clinical recommendations provided herein are solely those of the speaker. Practitioners should refer to the full indications for use and operating instructions of any products referenced before use. Hosts and producers are paid employees or consultants of David Thurman, and our guests are not compensated.